Throughout my decades observing political movements, I witnessed something troubling: how easily intelligent people deceive themselves when ideology becomes their lens for viewing reality. The 20th century taught us that the most dangerous lies aren't told by cynical politicians to naive masses, but by sincere believers to themselves. Both progressive intellectuals and conservative traditionalists construct elaborate justifications for their preferred worldviews, filtering evidence through ideological prisms that distort rather than clarify. This self-deception isn't mere intellectual error, it's a betrayal of the empirical spirit that democratic societies require to function. Today, as America faces its own ideological polarization, understanding how political movements systematically mislead themselves becomes essential for preserving rational discourse. The patterns I observed during the Cold War, the selective blindness, the moral double standards, the transformation of preferences into necessities, resurface whenever political passion overwhelms analytical rigor. Chapter 1: The Progressive Myth of Inevitable Historical Progress. The most seductive lie progressive intellectuals tell themselves is that history moves inexorably toward greater justice, equality, and human liberation. This comforting narrative transforms political preferences into cosmic necessities, making opposition appear not merely wrong but historically obsolete. I watched brilliant minds during the Cold War convince themselves that Soviet communism, despite its obvious brutalities, represented humanity's future because it aligned with their theory of historical progress. This progressive mythology operates through several mechanisms of self-deception. First, it reframes political choices as scientific discoveries. Progressives don't advocate for certain policies, they simply recognize what history demands. Second, it treats setbacks as temporary obstacles rather than evidence against the theory itself. When communist regimes collapsed into tyranny, true believers explained this as premature implementation rather than flawed conception. Third, it assigns moral superiority to those who align with the supposed direction of history, creating an intoxicating sense of righteousness. The American progressive movement exhibits similar patterns today. Complex social problems become simple matters of being on the right side of history. Opposition to progressive policies isn't seen as legitimate disagreement but as reactionary resistance to inevitable change. This mindset corrupts democratic debate by transforming empirical questions into moral certainties. Instead of asking whether specific policies achieve their intended effects, progressives ask whether they align with historical destiny. This historical determinism breeds dangerous intellectual arrogance. If your political positions reflect history's trajectory, why engage seriously with critics? Why examine unintended consequences? The mythology provides ready explanations for any uncomfortable evidence: resistance from reactionary forces, insufficient commitment to the cause, or sabotage by those who refuse to accept historical inevitability. Most tragically, this lie prevents progressives from learning from their mistakes. When policies fail to produce expected results, the problem cannot be with the underlying theory. History doesn't make errors. The fault must lie with implementation, timing, or opposition. This creates a closed intellectual system impervious to empirical correction, the hallmark of ideological rather than scientific thinking. Chapter 2: The Conservative Fantasy of Unchanging Human Nature. Conservative intellectuals construct their own elaborate self-deception, centering on the myth that human nature remains constant across time and circumstance. This comfortable fiction allows them to dismiss calls for social change as naive utopianism while positioning themselves as guardians of eternal truths. Like their progressive counterparts, conservatives transform political preferences into metaphysical certainties, claiming their positions reflect timeless wisdom rather than contemporary interests. The conservative mythology operates through different but equally problematic mechanisms. They treat historically contingent arrangements as natural law, confusing what has existed with what must exist. Traditional gender roles, economic hierarchies, and social institutions become expressions of human nature rather than products of specific historical circumstances. This allows conservatives to resist change not on practical grounds, which would require engaging with evidence, but on philosophical ones that brook no empirical refutation. I observed this pattern repeatedly during debates over decolonization, civil rights, and social reform. Conservative intellectuals didn't argue that existing arrangements worked better, they argued that alternative arrangements violated human nature. This rhetorical strategy transforms political opposition into anthropological expertise, elevating conservative preferences to the status of scientific knowledge about human behavior. The fantasy becomes particularly dangerous when conservatives face rapid social change. Rather than analyzing new circumstances and adapting their approaches, they retreat into assertions about unchanging fundamentals. Contemporary American conservatives exhibit this tendency when confronting technological disruption, demographic shifts, and cultural evolution. Instead of developing responses appropriate to new conditions, they invoke eternal principles that supposedly govern all human societies. This mythology also corrupts conservative thinking about institutions. Instead of examining whether specific institutional arrangements serve contemporary needs effectively, conservatives defend them as embodiments of timeless wisdom. They mistake the forms of successful institutions for their functions, preserving structures while losing sight of purposes. This institutional fetishism prevents conservatives from distinguishing between valuable principles and outdated practices. Most fundamentally, the conservative fantasy prevents learning from changing circumstances. If human nature never changes, then new challenges simply require applying old solutions. This closes conservatives off from innovation and adaptation, making them vulnerable to being overwhelmed by developments they refuse to acknowledge as genuinely novel. Chapter 3: How Ideological Thinking Corrupts Empirical Observation. Both progressive and conservative movements share a more fundamental problem: they've abandoned empirical observation in favor of ideological interpretation. Instead of examining reality to test their theories, they examine reality to confirm their theories. This transformation of evidence into illustration represents perhaps the most serious threat to democratic discourse, because it makes rational persuasion impossible. The process begins subtly. Political movements develop explanatory frameworks that seem to account for observed phenomena. These frameworks prove psychologically satisfying because they provide meaning, purpose, and intellectual coherence. Gradually, however, the framework becomes more important than the phenomena it supposedly explains. Contradictory evidence gets reinterpreted rather than incorporated. Anomalies become exceptions rather than challenges to the theory. I witnessed this corruption most clearly in intellectual responses to totalitarian regimes. Progressive intellectuals who visited the Soviet Union returned with glowing reports of social progress, scientific planning, and human liberation. They saw what their theory told them they should see, not what empirical observation revealed. Similarly, conservative intellectuals often praised authoritarian regimes that preserved traditional hierarchies, overlooking their brutality because it didn't fit their preferred narrative about order and stability. This selective perception operates through sophisticated mechanisms. Ideologically committed thinkers develop specialized vocabularies that prejudge empirical questions. Problems become contradictions that theory predicts rather than challenges that theory must address. Failures become growing pains rather than fundamental flaws. Success in one area compensates for disaster in another because the theory requires overall vindication. The corruption spreads through intellectual communities via peer pressure and professional incentives. Scholars who raise inconvenient questions find themselves marginalized, while those who provide theoretical confirmation gain recognition and advancement. Academic disciplines develop orthodoxies that newcomers must accept to gain credibility. Intellectual independence becomes professional suicide. Perhaps most insidiously, ideological thinking transforms uncertainty into false certainty. Complex social phenomena that resist simple explanation get forced into predetermined categories. Ambiguous evidence gets interpreted as decisive support. Provisional conclusions become eternal truths. This false certainty makes ideological thinkers confident in their judgments even when empirical evidence remains fragmentary or contradictory. Chapter 4: The Moral Double Standards That Enable Self-Deception. Political movements maintain their self-deceptions through elaborate systems of moral double standards that excuse their own failures while condemning identical behaviors in opponents. These double standards aren't conscious hypocrisy, they're unconscious mechanisms that protect ideological believers from confronting uncomfortable truths about their own movements. Understanding these mechanisms reveals how intelligent people can systematically blind themselves to evidence that challenges their worldview. The most common double standard involves judging intentions versus results. Progressive movements excuse devastating consequences of their policies by pointing to noble intentions, while condemning conservative policies based solely on harmful outcomes regardless of motivation. Conservative movements reverse this standard, excusing their own harmful consequences while judging progressive policies by their worst possible interpretations. Neither side applies consistent criteria for evaluation. Another pervasive double standard concerns violence and coercion. Progressive intellectuals who condemned Western military interventions often excused or minimized communist violence as necessary for achieving social justice. Conservative intellectuals who celebrated law and order domestically often supported brutal dictatorships abroad when they served anti-communist purposes. Each side developed elaborate theoretical justifications for violence that aligned with their political preferences while condemning identical violence from opponents. The double standard extends to democratic norms and procedures. Progressives who invoke democratic legitimacy when they win elections often question the same legitimacy when they lose, discovering previously invisible flaws in electoral systems. Conservatives who celebrate democratic outcomes that favor their positions suddenly become concerned about majority tyranny when outcomes go against them. Both sides treat democratic institutions as legitimate only when they produce preferred results. Perhaps most revealing is the double standard regarding expertise and authority. Progressive movements demand deference to scientific expertise when it supports their positions while dismissing the same expertise when it raises uncomfortable questions. Conservative movements invoke traditional authority when it reinforces their preferences while rejecting identical authority when it challenges them. Neither side maintains consistent principles about when authority deserves respect. These double standards serve essential psychological functions for ideological believers. They preserve the movement's moral superiority while explaining away embarrassing evidence. They maintain group solidarity by establishing clear distinctions between virtuous insiders and corrupt outsiders. Most importantly, they prevent the kind of honest self-examination that might reveal fundamental flaws in the ideological framework itself. Chapter 5: Why Intelligence Makes Self-Deception More Sophisticated. The most disturbing discovery from my decades observing political movements is that intelligence often makes ideological self-deception more sophisticated rather than less likely. Brilliant individuals don't abandon ideology when confronted with contradictory evidence. They develop more elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain away inconvenient facts. This phenomenon poses particular dangers for democratic societies that rely on educated citizens to engage in rational political discourse. Intelligent ideological believers possess superior capacity for rationalization. When confronted with evidence that challenges their worldview, they don't simply ignore it, they construct complex explanations that preserve their theoretical framework while acknowledging uncomfortable facts. These explanations often display impressive intellectual creativity, drawing on vast knowledge to weave together seemingly contradictory information into coherent narratives that support predetermined conclusions. The process operates through several mechanisms. First, Intelligent believers develop nuanced distinctions that allow them to maintain general principles while making specific exceptions. Soviet apologists didn't deny Stalin's brutality. They explained it as regrettable but necessary given hostile capitalist encirclement. Conservative defenders of apartheid didn't deny its injustices. They argued that alternative arrangements would produce even worse outcomes for all involved. Second, intelligent believers master the art of shifting analytical levels. When macro-level evidence contradicts their theories, they focus on micro-level examples that support their position. When micro-level evidence proves problematic, they retreat to macro-level trends that supposedly vindicate their overall framework. This analytical agility makes their position virtually unassailable through empirical criticism. Third, intelligent believers develop sophisticated criteria for evaluating evidence. They become expert at identifying methodological flaws in studies that challenge their position while overlooking identical flaws in supportive research. They demand impossibly high standards of proof for claims that contradict their worldview while accepting minimal evidence for confirming claims. This double standard masquerades as scientific rigor. The tragedy is that these intellectual gifts could serve rational inquiry if directed toward honest empirical investigation rather than ideological defense. The same analytical skills that enable sophisticated self-deception could illuminate complex social phenomena if freed from predetermined conclusions. Democratic societies lose immensely when their most capable minds become servants of ideology rather than seekers of truth. Most troubling, intelligent ideological believers often become movement leaders whose sophisticated rationalizations influence less analytically skilled followers. Their intellectual authority lends credibility to positions that survive not because evidence supports them, but because brilliant minds have made them intellectually respectable through elaborate theoretical constructions. Chapter 6: The International Dimension: How Movements Project Their Myths Globally. Political movements don't confine their self-deceptions to domestic affairs. They project their mythologies onto the international arena, creating distorted worldviews that shape foreign policy and global engagement. This international dimension of ideological thinking poses particular dangers because it affects relations between nations and can contribute to international conflict when movements mistake their political preferences for universal truths. Progressive movements during the Cold War demonstrated this pattern clearly. They projected their domestic concerns about inequality and social justice onto the global stage, interpreting international conflicts through the lens of class struggle and anti-imperialism. This led them to romanticize Third World revolutionary movements regardless of their actual character, excusing brutality and oppression when perpetrated by movements that claimed progressive goals. The mythology of historical progress made any force opposing Western capitalism appear inherently virtuous. Conservative movements exhibited mirror-image distortions. They projected their domestic concerns about order and tradition onto international affairs, supporting authoritarian regimes that preserved hierarchical structures regardless of their brutality toward their own populations. The mythology of unchanging human nature made any force opposing communist expansion appear inherently legitimate, even when that force trampled on the democratic values conservatives claimed to defend. These projections created systematic blind spots in American foreign policy. Progressive influence led to naive support for revolutionary movements that quickly degenerated into tyranny. Conservative influence led to equally naive support for dictatorships that claimed anti-communist credentials while oppressing their own people. Both approaches substituted ideological wish fulfillment for careful analysis of complex local conditions. The pattern continues today as American political movements project their domestic mythologies onto contemporary global challenges. Progressives interpret international conflicts through frameworks of oppression and liberation that often miss crucial local dynamics. Conservatives interpret the same conflicts through frameworks of order and chaos that similarly obscure important contextual factors. Neither approach encourages the kind of empirical investigation that effective foreign policy requires. Perhaps most dangerous is how these projections create self-reinforcing cycles of confirmation bias. When international developments seem to confirm movement mythologies, believers point to global trends as validation of their domestic positions. When developments contradict their expectations, they blame hostile foreign interference or insufficient commitment to proper principles. The international arena becomes another source of evidence for predetermined conclusions rather than a realm of empirical investigation. This global projection of domestic mythologies impoverishes democratic debate about foreign policy by transforming complex international questions into simple extensions of domestic ideological conflicts. Chapter 7: Breaking Free: The Intellectual Virtues Democracy Requires. Democratic societies can only escape the trap of ideological self-deception by cultivating specific intellectual virtues that enable citizens to evaluate political claims empirically rather than ideologically. These virtues don't come naturally, they must be deliberately developed through educational practices and cultural norms that prioritize truth-seeking over group loyalty. The survival of democratic discourse depends on nurturing these capacities in enough citizens to maintain rational public debate. The first essential virtue is epistemic humility, recognition that our knowledge remains provisional and subject to revision based on new evidence. This humility protects against the false certainty that characterizes ideological thinking. Citizens who cultivate this virtue remain open to arguments that challenge their existing beliefs, treating political positions as working hypotheses rather than eternal truths. They distinguish between confidence based on evidence and confidence based on wishful thinking. The second crucial virtue is analytical independence, the capacity to evaluate arguments on their merits rather than their sources or their compatibility with preferred conclusions. This independence requires developing resistance to both peer pressure and authority claims that substitute social proof for empirical evidence. Citizens who achieve this independence can recognize valid points made by political opponents while identifying flaws in arguments from political allies. The third necessary virtue is empirical discipline, commitment to grounding political judgments in careful observation of actual outcomes rather than theoretical predictions or moral intentions. This discipline demands patience with complexity and uncertainty rather than rushing toward premature closure. It requires tracking the real-world effects of policies over time rather than evaluating them solely based on immediate political reactions. The fourth vital virtue is intellectual courage, willingness to express unpopular views when evidence supports them and to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about preferred political positions. This courage protects democratic debate from the conformity pressures that push discourse toward extremes. Citizens who develop this courage help maintain space for nuanced positions that don't fit neatly into partisan categories. These virtues must be institutionally supported through educational practices that reward truth-seeking over political correctness, media norms that prioritize accuracy over ideological confirmation, and professional standards that value empirical rigor over theoretical purity. Democratic societies must also develop cultural appreciation for intellectual independence as a civic virtue rather than treating it as political betrayal. The cultivation of these virtues offers the only reliable protection against the ideological self-deceptions that threaten democratic discourse. When enough citizens develop these capacities, political movements lose their ability to maintain collective delusions through mutual reinforcement. Evidence begins to matter more than ideology, and rational persuasion becomes possible again. Conclusion. The lies that political movements tell themselves aren't merely intellectual curiosities, they represent fundamental threats to democratic governance. When citizens lose the capacity to evaluate political claims empirically, democracy degenerates into tribal conflict where victory matters more than truth. My observations of 20th-century ideological movements reveal that this degeneration isn't inevitable, but preventing it requires constant vigilance and deliberate cultivation of intellectual virtues that don't come naturally to political animals like ourselves. The path forward demands recognizing that both progressive and conservative movements contain valuable insights alongside dangerous self-deceptions. Neither side possesses monopoly on truth or error. Democratic societies thrive when citizens can extract what's valuable from competing ideologies while rejecting what's false or harmful. This requires exactly the kind of analytical independence and empirical discipline that ideological thinking systematically undermines. The stakes couldn't be higher. Societies that succumb to ideological self-deception lose their capacity for rational self-correction, the essential feature that distinguishes democratic governance from alternatives. The intellectual virtues that democracy requires, humility, independence, empirical discipline, and courage, remain democracy's greatest assets precisely because they enable societies to learn from experience rather than repeat historical mistakes in new forms.